Hello, I'm John Godet. I wrote a new book called The Pharaoh's Treasure, and it's all about the origin of paper and the rise of Western civilization. After the Egyptians invented paper that was made from a papyrus plant back in 3000 BC, they used it themselves, and they also exported the paper throughout the world so that it spread throughout the known world and was used by a great number of people for over thousands of years. The plant that the Egyptians used to make the paper, of course, only grew in Egypt, and therefore the Egyptians had a monopoly over the paper that they produced as a result of this. And they also made a lot more paper than they needed for export so that they could make money off of this for foreign exchange. So for thousands of years, the pharaohs actually used the paper as a way of making money in foreign exchange. Therefore, it was called Pharaoh's treasure. And So for many, many years, papyrus paper was the only paper that was available throughout the world. And it was only later on that parchment came into use, and then finally pulp paper, which is the paper that we use today, the modern paper, came into use after 1000 AD when it was finally manufactured in such a way that it could be used for writing. The Egyptians made the papyrus paper from the reed that grew in the delta in the water that was coming out of the Nile River and spread out across the delta before it went into the Mediterranean. And they had quite a production going on. They had large areas where they harvested the plant, and they made paper from these reeds that they cut. They harvested the reeds, brought them into a place where they could use them, and then from there they made their paper. And this is what a piece of papyrus paper would look like when it was finally done. It was yellowish in color and had the fibers running through it, and when you held it up to the light you could see the pattern of the original pieces that were laid down at right angles to one another. But it was a high quality paper, very much like a very good bond paper of today. And here you have what look like what you see when you have a codex. You had the individual folded sheets that were sewn along the edges. And the early Bibles, Torahs, Korans, all of the Latin and Greek books that finally were made during, say, the first, second century were made out of papyrus paper, so it was used all over the Western world. Uh, in China, during all this time, papyrus paper was not available because it was not being imported. Instead, the ancient Chinese were using bamboo strips and, say, silk cloth. But the problem was that the silk cloth, even in those days, was very expensive, and bamboo strips were very difficult to to use. They had to be written on, then they had to be sewn together, and then bundled up, rolled up into big rolls, and it was a clumsy writing medium to use. So there is a theory that the development of China overall was held back. It was slowed because there wasn't an easy writing medium available during those early days. This slide shows the whole process from the beginning to the end. When you took the pulp, you could either boil the pulp up also to make it easier to make it pulp. You could put the bark and rags into some boiling water. Then you would grind it up and then mix it into a slurry with more water before you laid it out on the screen. And then finally you'd peel the pulp paper away from the screen to have the final product. So after the Chinese invented pulp paper, the process was taken over by the Arabs, and they improved on the method by using linen waste and instead of bark. And they also, so they produced a better quality paper. And then finally, the Europeans took over the process from the Arabs, and the Italians, for example, in the factories in Fabriano during the early Middle Ages were able to produce a rag paper similar to what the Arabs had been producing, but they were hardening the surface of the paper using this gelatin sizing. And that way they were able to produce a paper that was very appealing to the Westerners because you could use a quill pen to write on this new paper, and the Italians began making this paper in quantity, and it was a good paper, good quality, and it became a good selling export throughout the Middle East and throughout Europe. And finally, it was Italian paper of that type was the kind of paper that Gutenberg used when he began printing his early Bibles. So the lesson that we have then, at least the way I see it and the way I've explained it in my book, is that there's a paper world of today was built on the papyrus paper world of ancient times. In other words, people in the ancient world had already become accustomed to being able to write down things on paper, and they used it in all sorts of ways. They wrapped up stuff with papyrus paper. They used it for shopping lists, government records, and so on. In other words, the use of paper was already there and already in place. Well, after that, of course, after the first century AD, and well up until about maybe 600 or 700 AD, you had Chinese paper that was being developed, and then it was further developed by the Arabs. And eventually, what happened was that pulp paper, that was now the new thing in the world, was available and was going to be used by everyone, and it became essentially the modern paper world of today. But all of this was actually built on the ancient Egyptian concept of paper that was started by papyrus paper. In other words, the pulp paper, when it was introduced, and modern paper that we know today, was no big surprise to the people of the world. They already had something there, and they were using papyrus paper in that way. So at about this time then, the Islamic world was producing books. Millions of books were being printed, and they were developing all sorts of fast methods for reproducing books using parchment and papyrus paper and binding them with very nice bindings. At the same time, however, the Chinese were printing also many books using their block printing and their own paper that they were producing. The slowest of the lot were, in fact, the people in the West, because they were by then using parchment, which was a difficult material to produce, and it was an expensive material to produce. They were also still using their quill pens, so when they finished laboriously copying out a particular manuscript, they then had to bind it, and the binding took a while, and it was also troublesome. So the whole process was quite slow, and they fell behind these other parts of the world in terms of book production. Till the time of Gutenberg, that things changed. When Gutenberg came along in about 1455, within less than 50 years, there were 20 million books printed. It was an incredible number of books. It was a difference between what the West had before and what the West had then. So by the time of the Crusades, things had changed. The Islamic world was going downhill because of various factors. But the West was making a lot of progress because of printing, and if you measure civilization and its progress by the number of books, the West was forging ahead, all because of the printing press and the modern paper that had finally come in, that originally had been invented by the Chinese and then made into something that was much more useful by the people and by the Arabs, and then eventually used in the West to use for printing books. So that's the story that I have written out in my book called The Pharaoh's Treasure. And it's all about the origin of paper and how Western civilization went forward with the original paper, papyrus paper that was available, and how all that was supplanted eventually by the paper made by the Chinese from pulp, and how pulp paper had to evolve and then it came into its own later on in the by the Middle Ages. Uh, Pulp paper was all the rage and it was used from there on in. Anyway, I think you'll find the book is a very interesting book from that point of view. An awful lot of history is compressed in the book, but the message that I have in there is that papyrus paper was very, very useful and very much the paper that people used for many, many years, and that it set the stage for the modern paper world that we know today. Thank you very much.